"You're not my husband," she said. The mountain man replied, "Then let me try to be the wind that drifted down from the high ridge, carried the kind of cold that never apologized, the kind that slid through the pines and touched the skin, whether a person wanted company or not." And she felt every inch of it as she stepped out of the small cabin, her arms wrapped tight around herself, her breathing thin, not from the cold alone, but from the heaviness she carried inside. The mountain man, Calder Holt, stood a few yards away, splitting a short stack of firewood with movements as steady as the land around them, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm that matched his silence. And though he heard her step onto the porch, he didn't turn toward her at first, giving her the kind of space a grieving woman might need, the kind of space she both wanted and resented. She watched him long enough to see how carefully he placed each piece in the pile, not like a task he'd grown numb to, but like something that still mattered. And it struck her that even a man who lived so far from town, who slept beneath a roof he'd built with his own hands, treated firewood with more care than anyone had treated her feelings in a long time. He finally looked over his shoulder, his expression unreadable beneath the dark beard and the shadow of his hat, and he said her name, not softly, not sharply, just steady, as if saying it anchored him to the moment. "Mara." And she swallowed hard before answering, because hearing her name from someone who wasn't her husband felt wrong in a way she couldn't name. Calder nodded toward the steps, a question in the gesture, asking without speaking if she planned to stay outside long in the cold, and she stiffened because she didn't want him telling her what she should or shouldn't do. Yet she also knew he hadn't meant it that way, so she walked down the steps, brushing past him as she moved toward the corral, needing distance, even though she'd asked him 2 nights ago, through tears she still didn't remember wiping away, if she could stay here until she figured out where to go next. He'd said yes without hesitation. No conditions, no questions. And that made it harder somehow, because kindness from a stranger landed differently than kindness from a husband, and she wasn't sure yet if she trusted the weight of it. The saddle blanket on the fence was stiff with frost, and she touched it without meaning to, feeling the cold bite through her fingertips before she pulled back. And that was when Calder stepped closer, not invading, just appearing beside her like he'd crossed the distance in one quiet decision. And he said, "Storm coming from the north," his voice low, his breath forming a white trail in the air, and she nodded, though she'd already known by the shift in the wind, but she answered anyway because silence between them felt heavier than the sky. "I won't be in your way," she whispered, more defensive than she intended, and Calder's jaw worked for a moment before he replied, "You're not in my way." And those 4 simple words knocked something loose in her chest, something she wasn't ready to look at, so she stepped back toward the cabin, her heartbeat loud in her ears, and he didn't follow, didn't press, didn't ask. But his presence lingered like the quiet promise of warmth inside a place she wasn't sure she deserved yet. She didn't mean to remember the trail, but the mind has a way of opening old doors when the land goes quiet, and the mountains were too silent that morning, pressing her thoughts back toward the road that had carried her here. She sat at the small table in the cabin, watching the thin line of steam rise from the tin cup Calder had left for her on his way out. No note, no comment, just a cup of hot coffee placed within reach like a man offering help without asking for gratitude. And she held it between her palms, even after it cooled, because the warmth steadied her as the past unspooled in reluctant fragments. She'd left Dry Creek 2 weeks before, not because she wanted to, but because leaving was the only thing left, when staying meant listening to people whisper, "Poor wife," whenever she passed, their eyes sliding away from her like she was a story they didn't want to finish reading. And she'd tolerated that pity as long as she could, until one morning she found herself staring at the chair across from her at home, the chair her husband had once sat in every morning, and she realized she couldn't breathe in that house any longer. Her husband had been buried for 7 months, enough time for everything to fall apart and still feel unfinished. And though he'd been a quiet man, a decent one, his absence had weight, a weight heavier than the life she was left holding. And she knew then that staying in town would crush her slowly, inch by inch, beneath the memory of every promise he'd made and everyone they never had time to keep. She'd headed west, riding until the land felt big enough to swallow her grief without choking on it, stopping only when the storm hit the ridge 2 nights back and forced her to take shelter in the abandoned line shack she'd thought was empty, until Calder's voice came out of the shadows, calm and unimpressed, asking if she planned to freeze herself to death or if she wanted to come inside and warm up. She'd been too exhausted to argue, too numb to care, and he'd shown her the cabin that would become her temporary refuge, telling her she could stay until she figured out her next place, saying it with the same plain certainty a man uses when tying a horse or mending a boot, no sentiment, no expectation. She traced the rim of the cup with her thumb now, thinking of the way Calder had stood beside the fire that night, letting her cry without interruption, not touching her, not offering hollow comfort, just letting her exist without explanation. And it was that quiet acceptance that unnerved her more than any kindness she'd known. Outside, she heard the creak of the gate and the thud of his boots against the dirt as he led the mule toward the shed, and she wondered, not for the first time, why a man who lived so far from everyone would let a stranger stay under his roof, especially a woman carrying more sorrow than belongings. But then again, maybe the mountains made a person softer in certain ways and harder in others. She set the cup down and stepped outside, the cold hitting her again. But she didn't turn back this time, because the trail behind her was gone, and the one in front of her was still forming beneath her feet, one uncertain step at a time. Calder didn't look at her when she stepped outside, and she realized quickly that this was his way, not avoidance, not rudeness, but a man choosing silence the way others choose words. A man who measured everything before offering any part of himself. He was tightening the cinch on the mule, sleeves rolled up, forearms marked with old scars that didn't look like the kind a man earns from accidents, but from a life that had swung hard at him and gotten hit back just as hard. And he spoke without turning, his voice low and steady against the cold air. Storm's cleared. I'm riding up toward the ridge. You can stay here if you're still settling yourself. She wanted to ask why he cared, why he'd offered shelter, why he'd given her coffee, why he stayed up half the night adding wood to the fire so she wouldn't wake shivering. But the words tangled before they reached her mouth, so she just nodded, fingers curling into the worn edges of her coat, as she watched him check the mule's hoof with the kind of gentle efficiency men used only on things they cared about. He finally glanced at her then, just long enough for the weight of his eyes to land on her face like a quiet question. He wasn't going to ask out loud, and something about that look made her chest tighten because she wasn't ready for anyone to see her that clearly. Not yet, maybe not ever. If you need anything, he said, straightening, food's in the pantry. Axe is by the door. Water barrel's full. I'll be back by nightfall. She crossed her arms, partly to keep from shaking, partly to anchor herself because being around him made her feel like every wall she'd built was transparent in his presence. and she didn't know how to defend herself from a man who wasn't attacking her. "You don't have to look after me," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Calder studied her for a breath, then another, before answering in that same measured tone. "I'm not looking after you. I'm looking after my home. You're in it. That's all." But she knew that wasn't the whole truth. Men protecting their home didn't brew coffee for a grieving stranger or make sure her boots dried by the fire, and they certainly didn't sleep sitting upright in a chair just to give her the bed. He adjusted the strap on his rifle, but the moment he shifted to mount the mule, she caught something she hadn't expected. Hesitation, brief and almost invisible, as if leaving her alone in the cabin was harder for him than he wanted to admit, and it startled her enough to speak again. "Calder," she said quietly, and he paused, jaw tightening slightly as he waited. "Why did you let me stay?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the trees, breath fogging in the cold, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't the answer she expected. "Because you needed a place to stop falling, and this was the nearest ground." It wasn't tenderness. It wasn't poetry. It was truth, simple, solid, and heavy enough to steady her without touching her. He gave her a small nod, almost an apology for saying more than he meant to, then swung onto the mule and began up the trail, leaving her standing in the icy morning air with the strange realization that the safest she had felt in months was next to a man who kept his distance, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile, maybe her, maybe himself, maybe both. The cabin felt different after he left, too quiet in a way that made her aware of every creak in the walls and every sigh of wind slipping past the window frames. And she tried to busy herself, folding the blanket he'd given her, washing the tin cup she'd used, sweeping the dirt near the door. But no matter what she did, her ears kept searching for the sound of hooves returning, as if her body had decided on its own that Calder's presence was the new measure of safety and wasn't willing to pretend otherwise. She hated that, hated how quickly a stranger's steadiness had slipped beneath her defenses. But the truth was, she hadn't felt steady in months. Not since the night her husband had died, with her name on his lips, leaving her with a marriage full of unfinished apologies and a heart that had never been able to decide whether she loved him, feared him, or simply didn't know him at all. By midday she stepped outside, needing air more than warmth, and the cold hit her like a reminder that the world didn't care what she'd survived. The prairie spread wide and pale beneath a sky that looked hard enough to break, and the mountains rose behind the cabin like a wall no memory could climb over. Yet knowing Calder had walked those ridges since before sunrise made them feel less like barriers and more like boundaries he'd already tested and approved. She told herself she wasn't waiting for him, just watching the land, learning the shape of the place she'd stumbled into. But when she finally heard a distant crunch of hooves, her breath caught before she could stop it. He appeared through the trees, broad-shouldered and quiet as always, guiding the mule with a careful hand as though he didn't want to disturb the cold air more than necessary. He noticed her on the porch immediately, his eyes narrowing just slightly, concern masked as observation, and she looked away fast, pretending to adjust her coat, but he'd already seen the truth written all over her. "Everything all right?" he asked when he dismounted, his voice low enough that she felt it more than heard it. She nodded too quickly. "Just needed air." Calder studied her the way he studied weather, silent, patient, thorough, then gave a single slow nod as if filing her answer away with everything else he'd noticed since the moment he found her collapsing in the snow the day before. "Storm shifting east," he said, unloading a small bundle from the mule. "Got a day or two of calm. You should rest while you can." She stiffened, irritated by how easily he assumed responsibility for her well-being. Yet there was nothing patronizing in his tone, only fact, the kind of fact a man learns by listening hard to the world. "You always talk like you expect me to break," she said, before she could stop herself. Calder paused, the slightest flicker of something moving behind his eyes, regret, understanding, or maybe recognition of a wound he knew too well. "No," he said quietly, "I talk like someone who's seen what happens when people try to pretend they're fine when they ain't." She felt the words hit deeper than she wanted them to, but she refused to let her voice show it. "And what about you?" she asked. "You pretend pretty well." He didn't answer right away. He just handed her the bundle, which turned out to be jerky, dried apples, a wrapped piece of cornbread, and finally said, "I don't pretend, I endure." For a heartbeat they stood there, close enough for the cold between them to crack into something else, something warmer, something dangerous. And she had the sudden, unsettling thought that this mountain man lived with a kind of loneliness that was too familiar to ignore. She opened her mouth to speak, to soften the silence, or fill it, or break it. She didn't know. But Calder simply stepped back, giving her space again, like he always did, like he believed he wasn't allowed to stand too near. And for the first time, she wished he wouldn't. When dusk settled over the valley like a slow falling curtain, the cabin took on that amber glow that made everything inside feel softer than it had any right to be, and she found herself sitting near the hearth with her knees pulled close, pretending she was only warming her hands while Calder moved around the room in that steady, deliberate way of his, checking the shutters, banking the fire, listening to the wind as if it carried news meant only for him. She didn't understand him, not fully, but she understood the silence he carried, the way it felt heavy and old, shaped by something he'd learned to hold alone. It made her wonder what kind of man could live in these mountains for years with only his own shadow for company. When he finally sat on the other side of the room, she noticed the stiffness in his movements, the way he avoided flexing his left shoulder, and before she could think better of it, she said, "You're hurt." Calder didn't look up, just shrugged his good shoulder. "It's nothing worth speaking on." But the way he said it, quiet, almost resigned, felt like a door half open, and she stepped through without permission. "You get hurt because you keep carrying everything alone," she said, her voice steadier than her courage. "People can't live like that forever." For a long time, he said nothing, and the silence stretched until she wondered if she'd pushed too far. But then he lifted his gaze, and something raw flickered there. Not anger, not defensiveness, just a truth he didn't usually let anyone see. "I don't carry everything alone," he said. "I carry what's mine, and I don't put my weight on people who didn't ask for it." She swallowed, feeling the heat of the fire on her cheeks, but knowing it wasn't the fire making her breath unsteady. "Maybe someone would choose to help," she whispered. That stopped him cold. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on her in a way that made her heart thud hard against her ribs. "And what if I'd already broken things once?" he asked. "What if trusting me cost someone more than they meant to lose? You tell me, how many chances does a man deserve before he stops asking for any?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, unsure how to answer, unsure what wound she was brushing against. "Who did you lose?" she finally asked. His jaw tightened, and he looked toward the window, toward the dark ridgeline etched against the fading sky. "My brother," he said, the words low but clear. "3 winters back. Storm took him. Should have been me. He followed me out there because he trusted I knew those ridges better than he did. And I let him down." She felt the weight of it settle between them, a story heavy enough to shape a man's whole life. "Calder," she whispered, the name slipping out softer than she meant, softer than she thought she could say anything. "You didn't kill him. A storm did." He didn't move, but she saw something fracture. Not break, just shift, like ice beginning to thaw. "Doesn't matter," he murmured. "I still hear him sometimes when the wind hits those pines the same way." Something inside her broke at the thought of a man carrying that kind of guilt alone in a cabin in the mountains with nothing but his memories to argue with. Without thinking, she rose from the hearth and crossed the room, slow but certain. And when she stopped in front of him, his breath caught as if he hadn't expected her to actually come close. She knelt so she was level with him, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. "You saved me," she said, "not just from the cold, from myself, from what I thought my life had to be. You didn't fail your brother, you've just been punishing yourself for surviving." For a long, breathless moment, he didn't look away, didn't retreat, didn't hide. He let her see him, all the wounds and guilt and the tired, stubborn hope beneath it. And when he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're offering." "No," she said, "but I know what I'm not leaving." His eyes closed for one heartbeat, just one, and when they opened again, she saw it. The quiet, devastated relief of a man who had not been allowed to lean on anyone in years. And though he didn't touch her, the space between them felt thinner than breath. The night deepened until the world outside vanished into black pine silhouettes and quiet wind. But inside the cabin, the fire kept a low, steady glow, casting soft gold across her face as she stayed kneeling in front of him, closer than she'd ever dared to be. Calder's breath shifted, not rough or warning, just unsteady, in a way that told her he wasn't used to someone being within arm's reach of his private hurts. And for a long moment, he looked like a man deciding whether to stay made of stone or finally let himself be something human. "You should sit," he said at last, voice low but uncertain, as if he didn't trust himself with her that close. She didn't move, only searched his eyes and whispered, "I'm already where I want to be." That sentence changed something, just enough for him to look away, jaw working once before he spoke again. "You think I'm the kind of man you can build a life with, but you don't know half of what I've done or failed to do." She felt the words like stones he was stacking between them and gently pushed her hand against one of them, laying her palm against his uninjured forearm. He sucked in a breath as if the touch burned and froze him at the same time, but he didn't pull away. "Tell me then," she murmured. "Tell me what kind of man you think you are." His eyes flicked back to hers, tired and challenged all at once. "I'm a man who has taken punches he deserved, and some he didn't. A man who's buried too many people and not enough regret. A man who knows how to track, hunt, build, survive, but not how to be what someone needs." She shook her head slowly, never breaking eye contact. "You're wrong. You've been what I needed every day since the moment you found me. You just don't believe you deserve anything back." His throat moved, one deep swallow, one silent fight against emotion he probably hadn't let out since long before she ever arrived. Finally, he said, "When you tell me I'm wrong, why do I want to believe you?" She moved her hand from his arm to his hand, threading her fingers through his, waiting for him to tense, to retreat. But instead, Calder looked at their joined hands like he didn't understand how it had happened, like he didn't trust it, but couldn't make himself let go. "Because," she whispered, leaning in a little, "nobody ever stayed long enough to teach you the difference between being alone and being unworthy." He stared at her then, really stared, as if he were memorizing her face in the firelight, the way her eyes softened, the way her breath hitched, but she refused to look away. "And what if I break you?" he whispered. "You won't," she said. "You've saved me too many times already without even knowing it." He blinked once, slow, stunned, as if the idea itself was foreign. "You think I saved you?" She nodded. "And I think you've been waiting for someone to save you too." The words hit him harder than she expected. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in surrender, like a man finally admitting he was tired. He leaned back in the chair, looking at her hand still holding his. "If you stay," he said quietly, "I'll try. I won't promise perfection, but I'll try to be the kind of man you deserve." She rose slowly from her kneeling position and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed, close enough that she felt his breath catch again. "I don't want perfection, Calder," she said softly. "I want you." His head bowed, just a little, as if the weight of her choosing him knocked the air from his chest. "No one's ever said that to me," he confessed. She took his hand again, steady and sure. "Then hear it now," she whispered, "and hear it as many times as you need, because I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time since she had met him, she felt it, the way he leaned into her presence instead of away from it, the way the mountain man who had survived everything finally let himself be chosen. The storm rolled in just past dawn, a low rumble over the ridgeline that made the window panes tremble, and Calder was already at the door with his rifle when she stepped onto the porch, shawl tight around her shoulders, feeling the air shift with a warning she didn't understand until she saw the silhouette riding up the muddy trail. A tall, sharp-shouldered man on a bay stallion, dressed too fine for mountain country, moving with the confidence of someone who believed the world, and every woman in it, still owed him something. Calder froze, fingers tightening on the rifle, and she felt his whole body change beside her, the softness of last night replaced instantly with steel. The rider approached, rain hitting his hat brim, and when he lifted his face, her breath ripped out of her chest. It was Elias, the man she'd married at 16, the man who drank more than he worked, who gambled away every dollar he ever had, who left her with bruises on her ribs and fear in her spine, and who she'd prayed was dead after he disappeared 2 winters ago. "Well now," Elias said, swinging out of the saddle with a swagger that made her stomach twist. "Seems like my wife's been living mighty comfortable while I've been scraping by." Calder stepped in front of her without hesitation, one arm angled back to keep her behind him. "You shouldn't be here," Calder said, voice low, dangerous, carrying the kind of warning that would make a sane man turn around. But Elias had never been sane in the ways that mattered. He grinned at her, ignoring Calder entirely. "Darlin', I ain't ridden all the way into these cursed mountains to hear this stranger tell me where I belong. You're mine, and you know the law says a wife goes where her husband goes." Her chest tightened, fear crashing through her, memories she'd buried cracking open like rotten boards. But Calder's presence steadied her, his back a wall between her and the past. She isn't yours, Calder said. Not anymore. Elias barked a laugh. And what are you? Her mountain keeper? Her new man? Calder didn't blink. I told her last night I'd try to be, if she wanted me to. Even through the fear, heat flushed up her neck. Elias's smile vanished, replaced by something uglier. You think you can take what's mine? He reached for her arm, same brutal speed she remembered. But Calder moved first, grabbing Elias's wrist with a grip that forced him to his knees in the mud. Elias hissed with pain, spitting curses. Touch her again, Calder growled, and you won't be walking off this mountain. Rain hammered the roof, thunder split the sky, and she suddenly felt the truth burn through her fear. Calder would fight for her. Calder would bleed for her. Calder would not let her be dragged back into hell. She stepped forward, placing her hand on Calder's shoulder, grounding both of them. Let him go, she said softly. Not because she feared Elias, but because she didn't want Calder to become something he wasn't. Calder released him, stepping back but still blocking her with his body. Elias staggered upright, clutching his wrist. This ain't over, he spat. The law's on my side. Preacher married us, papers and all. For the first time, she stepped around Calder, lifting her chin high even while trembling inside. No, she said, voice barely steady but strong enough to not break. The law says a marriage ends when a husband disappears for over a year without word, especially when everyone knew you abandoned me. Elias blinked, thrown off. He didn't know she'd learned that from the circuit judge last spring. Calder turned his head slightly, surprised but proud. She continued, I'm not going with you. Not now. Not ever again. Elias's expression twisted, fury and disbelief crashing together. But the storm behind him cracked lightning across the sky, as if the mountain itself was done with him. You'll regret this, he snarled. He mounted his horse, rain pouring off him like dark rage, and rode back down the trail without looking back. Her legs finally gave out, and Calder caught her instantly, arms strong and steady, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. You did that, he whispered into her hair. You faced him, not me, you. She clung to him, shaking. I couldn't have if you weren't here. He held her tighter, voice roughening. I'm here, and I'm staying. And for the second time in her life, she chose the man who protected her soul rather than the one who had broken it. The storm broke sometime after noon, leaving the mountains washed clean and shining, the air sharp with pine and cold river mist. And though Elias was long gone down the trail, she still felt the tremor of that morning, shaking inside her as Calder carried in firewood, setting the logs down with more care than strength, as if he didn't want to startle her with even the sound of wood touching stone. She sat at the rough-hewn table, fingers curled around a tin cup gone cold, watching him move across his own cabin with a hesitance she'd never seen in him before. Calder, the man who walked into blizzards, faced wolves, rebuilt half his homestead with his bare hands, now slowing his steps as if every motion might unsettle her. When he finally turned toward her, wiping rain from his beard, his voice was gentle but too controlled. You should rest, he said. She shook her head. I don't want to rest. I need to understand what happens now. Calder leaned against the table opposite her, keeping a respectful distance, but his eyes held that focused, unwavering steadiness she had come to trust more than warmth or kindness. What happens now, he said carefully, is whatever you want. Not what he wants, not what the law wants, what you want. Those words landed deep enough to sting, because she wasn't used to wanting anything. Years with Elias had taught her survival, not desire, obedience instead of choice. "You saw how he looked at me," she whispered, "like he could just take me because he decided to." Calder's jaw tightened. "He won't, not while I'm breathing." She swallowed, heart thudding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Calder, why did you say those words to him? When you told him you wanted to try being my husband?" He drew a slow breath as if bracing himself. "Because they were true." Her pulse stuttered. He held her gaze as if he'd been holding it for months. "I didn't plan to say it. I didn't plan any of this. But last night, when you stood in that doorway asking who you were to me, I realized I'd already made a choice. I just hadn't said it out loud." She looked down, fingers trembling around the cup. "I didn't think I deserved anything like that." Calder moved then, not close, but closer, pulling out the chair across from her, sitting down slowly so she wouldn't feel cornered. "Deserve?" he echoed. "You think love is something you earn by suffering first? What you deserve is peace, safety, a life without flinching whenever a man lifts his hand too fast." Her eyes burned, not from pain, but from the strange ache of hearing words she didn't know how to hold. "I don't know how to be anyone's wife," she confessed. "Not properly." Elias made sure of that. Calder's eyes softened, a different kind of heat replacing the fury from earlier. "I'm not asking you to be anything for me. I'm asking if you want to stay with me in a way that means something." She lifted her gaze, searching his face for fear or doubt, but there was none, only sincerity, steady as the mountains themselves. "But why?" she whispered. "You could have chosen anyone, someone untouched by all this." Calder's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering beneath the ruggedness. "Because the moment I found you in that ravine 3 weeks ago, soaked to the bone, shaking and trying to hide the bruise on your jaw, something in me changed. I told myself I was just helping you heal, just giving you a place to stay." His voice dropped lower. "But every day I saw more of the woman you are without him. Brave, quiet, thoughtful, and it got harder to pretend I didn't feel it." She felt the breath leave her chest as if his words had opened something she'd kept locked tight. "And when Elias came," Calder continued, "I realized I couldn't stand the thought of him claiming one part of you, not your fear, not your future, not your name." Silence settled, warm and heavy, broken only by the soft hiss of the fire. "Tell me something," she said, her voice barely workable. "If I'd asked you last night, really asked you, to be my husband, would you have said yes then?" Calder's answer came without hesitation. Yes, every time. Her heart kicked hard enough to hurt, and he reached across the table, slow as the sunrise, offering his hand without touching her first. A question, not a claim. She looked at his hand, then at the man who had fought her past in a way she never could have, and placed her trembling fingers in his. The warmth of his palm was immediate, grounding. Calder's voice was barely above a breath. "Then let me prove it, not through words, through the way I choose you, every morning you wake up in this cabin." Outside, the clouds broke fully, and a beam of clean mountain sunlight crossed the floor between them like a quiet promise. The mountain was too quiet that morning, the kind of unnatural stillness that made the pines stand stiff and the birds disappear into higher branches. And she felt it first, a pulse of dread moving through her body before any sound reached the cabin. She was at the wash basin, sleeves rolled up, hair still damp from the river, when Calder stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee and froze mid-sip, his entire posture sharpening like a blade being drawn. She rushed to the doorway just as the faint thump of hooves drifted through the valley, growing steady, purposeful, wrong. Calder didn't turn, didn't speak. He simply handed her the coffee, a quiet gesture he'd made a dozen times before. But today it meant, "Stay behind me." She obeyed, but her fingers trembled around the tin cup as the riders came into view. 3 of them, all strangers except for the last man atop the biggest horse, his hat pulled low, his coat too fine for mountain trails. Elias. Her stomach collapsed inward. Even the memory of his voice made her spine go rigid. Calder stepped down from the porch just as the riders stopped 10 paces from the cabin, snow dust puffing beneath their horses. Elias smiled, a lazy, practiced curl that used to mean danger long before she had the courage to believe it. "You've been busy," he drawled, his eyes sliding over Calder before landing on her with slow, poisonous satisfaction. "Ran off and found yourself a mountain man to warm your feet by the fire?" Calder didn't take the bait. "State your business." Elias laughed. "My business? That woman standing behind you is my wife." The word struck her like a slap. Calder's voice stayed even. "She told you she isn't." Elias's gaze darkened. "She doesn't get to decide that." Her breath snapped shallow, fear rising like cold water drowning reason. But Calder shifted slightly, placing more of his body between her and Elias, his stance still calm yet coiled. "She does," he said. Elias leaned forward in the saddle, grin twisting cruel. "Tell me, mountain man, did she tell you how she ran? How she stole from me? How she broke her vows?" Her throat closed, panic rising like smoke. She wanted to deny every word, but her voice was gone, trapped beneath the weight of years she'd survived rather than lived. Calder said her name quietly, steady as a lifeline. She stepped out from behind him, shaking, but standing. "I didn't steal from you. You locked me in that barn for 3 days. You left me without food. You told me I wasn't worth a decent life." Elias's face cracked, rage quick and ugly. "I gave you everything." "You took everything," she whispered. The men behind Elias straightened, sensing the shift. Calder's jaw tightened, but he kept still, letting her speak. "You didn't want a wife," she said, louder now. "You wanted a possession." Elias spat in the dirt. "Cute speech. Doesn't change the fact she belongs with me." Calder finally stepped forward, voice low and lethal. "She's not going anywhere with you." Elias smirked. "You think you can stop me? You and what law?" Calder didn't blink. "The kind of law that stands its ground." Elias nodded to his men, and their hands drifted toward their holsters. Calder didn't move to draw, didn't flinch. Instead, he said, "If you reach for a gun, I won't shoot first, but I will shoot last." The air tightened, heatless and electric, her heart beating so hard it blurred the edges of her sight. Elias tilted his head, studying Calder long enough to feel the truth in the words. This wasn't bravado, wasn't a bluff. This was a man who didn't want bloodshed, but wouldn't hesitate if forced. "Fine," Elias said at last, curling his lip. "If you want to fight, we do it proper. Tomorrow at dawn. down in the ravine. Her legs nearly gave out. "No," she choked. "Calder, no." Calder's hand barely brushed hers, enough to calm, not enough to claim. "I'm not fighting him," he murmured. "I'm ending him." Elias jerked his reins, turning his horse away. "Sunrise," he said. "She comes home with me after." When the riders were gone, the silence returned, heavy, suffocating, endless, until she whispered, "He'll kill you." Calder looked at her gently, the storm in his eyes softened by something deeper. "Only if I let him." She shook her head, tears burning hot. "Promise me you won't face him alone." Calder stepped closer, brushing a tear from her cheek with the back of his knuckle, the softest touch he'd ever given her. "I promise you something better," he said. "Tomorrow you'll wake up knowing he'll never touch your life again." And despite the terror tightening every part of her, she believed him, because Calder didn't speak in threats or hopes. He spoke in truths. Dawn came slow and cold over the mountain, the sky bruised purple at its edges, as if the night had held on too tight before letting go, and she had barely slept, sitting upright in the chair by the window, watching Calder pace the porch with the same steady rhythm of a man preparing not for a fight, but for an ending he'd already accepted. When he came inside, the lantern light caught the calm in his eyes, the kind that wasn't courage or arrogance, but certainty, and it terrified her. "You don't have to do this," she said for the 100th time, voice raw and thin. Calder took his coat from the hook, brushed the dust from his hat, and knelt in front of her the way he had the night the river almost swept her away, gentle, grounded, absolute. "I'm not doing this to prove anything," he said. "I'm doing it so you never have to run again." She shook her head, tears rising fast. "He'll shoot first. He'll cheat. He always cheats." Calder cupped her cheek with his rough palm, thumb stroking once, steadying her breath. "Then he'll learn what happens when a man mistakes cruelty for strength." She grabbed his coat, desperately clinging to the fabric. "If you don't come back." Calder leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers, the closest he'd ever held her, the quietest he'd ever spoken. "I'll come back," he murmured, "because you asked me to try to be your husband, and I'm not finished trying yet." The words broke something in her, something she'd kept locked away long before Calder found her shivering on his porch. She let him go because she couldn't take his choice away, but as he walked down the steps and disappeared into the thinning light, a part of her shattered, leaving nothing but fear and the echo of a promise too gentle to forget. The ravine was half-shadowed when Calder arrived, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Elias waited with his 2 men at his back, but Calder came alone, just as he'd said he would. "You made it," Elias sneered. "Ready to lose that mountain you hide behind?" Calder didn't answer the insult. He simply stepped into the clearing, hands loose at his sides, shoulders relaxed, giving Elias nothing to push against. "This ends clean," Calder said. "Just you and me." Elias grinned, but his eyes flickered with something like doubt. "Count?" he asked. Calder nodded. 3. Elias's fingers twitched. 1. Calder moved before the second number, not drawing early, but stepping sideways, forcing Elias to adjust, disrupting the timing Elias relied on. By the time Elias reached 2, Calder's gun was already in hand, not fired, just drawn, its barrel pointed steady and calm. Elias froze, realizing too late that the mountain man hadn't come to duel. He'd come to end fear. Elias swung wildly, firing first, but the bullet buried itself in a pine trunk. Calder fired second and last, sending Elias's gun spinning from his hand as he collapsed to his knees with a scream, clutching his wrist. Calder didn't aim again. He didn't need to. "You're done," he said quietly. "You don't follow her. You don't look for her. You don't speak her name again." Elias spat curses, but the men behind him had already backed away, seeing clearly what their leader refused to. They dragged him to his horse, fear overtaking loyalty, and before they rode off, Calder said one final thing, low, controlled, absolute. "If you ever come back here, you won't walk away again." Elias didn't argue. She was already running down the path when Calder climbed the ridge, breath breaking, hair loose, eyes wide with terror that hadn't yet realized the danger was gone. When she saw him, her knees gave out with relief so violent it left her sobbing. Calder dropped to the ground with her, catching her shoulders. "Hey," he whispered, "I'm right here." She pressed her forehead to his chest, gripping him like she feared he might vanish. "You came back," she cried. Calder rested his chin on her hair, holding her as if she weighed nothing. "I told you I would." She pulled back just enough to see his face, her voice trembling. "What now?" Calder brushed her tears with his thumb, the morning sun catching in his eyes. "Now," he said softly, "I keep trying to be the man you deserve, unless you want me to stop trying." She shook her head hard, breath shaking. "Don't stop." Calder exhaled slowly, as if those two words had changed the entire weight of the world on his shoulders. "Then come home," he murmured, standing and lifting her with him. Not as someone running from her past, but as someone choosing her future. And for the first time since she'd whispered those terrified words on his cabin floor, "You're not my husband," she understood what he'd meant when he answered, "Then let me try to be." He wasn't asking for a vow. He was offering one. And she took his outstretched hand as the sun rose behind them, knowing the fear was finally over and the trying could finally begin.